Hi all, welcome to week 7. This week we're going to be discussing natives of the Northwest Coast. So I've put up a map in this. There's also a map in your book. Stretches all the way up from kind of Juneau, southern Alaska area, all the way down to the very tip of northern California, or southern Oregon. We're looking at 1,500 miles of coastline. And again, really, your book is pretty much dividing natives that are related to certain environments and weather conditions. And in this particular area, we are really looking at the Northwest Coast, which tends to be very wet, especially in the winter, and mild, not as cold typically. However, at certain times, kind of this 14,000 year time period that we're looking at, there are periods of very cold weather and kind of warming. Cool summers. However, again, I think more recently there's been different heating patterns, and some of my friends in Oregon and Washington, obviously, can get pretty hot up there. And Washington over the last few years has had record amounts of forest fires and whatnot. So again, weather changing, and weather has been warming there for a while now. Definitely in terms of the environment, we're really, really focused on marine life, river life, lake fish, also waterfowl, those kinds of things, and really a densely wooded population. This little other picture here on the side kind of points to the different areas and how a typical native group would have built their village or their sedentary housing. And you can see kind of the long houses, cedar planks, we'll talk about those, and then the totem poles in the back, the forest behind that, but they're always right really next to kind of a river inlet or mouth, leading out into kind of ocean areas or whatnot. So at least on the coast, this is what it would look like. And these were the prime locations in terms of the Northwest Coast natives. If you could be on the ocean and go gather shellfish like this woman right here on the shore, and then also catch sea life and have the wood behind you, that was kind of a major part of being successful in this area. Plants, animals, and subsistence. You're going to hear the word salmon a ton in this lesson because salmon was their primary resource, not just protein, but really they utilize the whole salmon in terms of the fats and the oils of different fishes as well. Whales, trout, shellfish. In terms of land animals, mountain goats, bears, hares were also captured, but were not a vital part of their kind of existence and did not play a super huge connection in terms of their supernatural connection to the earth as well. Fir and cedar are a big part of their wood technology that we use for housing and their canoes and everything else. Berries and fruit were gathered in the forest. Again, we're going to have black raspberries as part of this area. Choke cherries, a lot of those other things as well. Algae from the ocean was also gathered. So seaweed, algae, those were also a big part of their kind of balancing of diet. When we talk about maybe plant life that they ate, that would be it along with that as well. Tobacco was the only crop that was domesticated, at least in terms of our definition of domestication, which is that the tobacco was tended to and planted and cared for, whereas other things were just gathered. So in terms of the history, you need to kind of keep these kind of dates set. 14 to 10,000 years ago, most of the sites are underwater. So this is where underwater archaeology is starting to have an impact. Again, kind of sea level rising. We're looking at about 500 feet. So if these people preferred the coastline, you can just imagine that most of these sites are going to be underwater, at least in this early time period. By 10,000 years, we definitely have people living here in this area. And then the Athabascan groups move in about 7,000 years ago. So these are the language groups that are moving in kind of at a second migratory area from kind of that subarctic Arctic area. 5,000 years ago, the sea reaches the modern levels. And then at 45,000 years ago, we have evidence of war. Now, remember, in terms of what I talk about with war, this is a huge topic, right? And looking at what types of societies exist and how to distinguish whether or not war came out of a ranked society mentality or was it related to subsistence strategy? I'm going to go into more detail on that kind of process because, to be honest, the Northwest Coast peoples give us a good example of what sedentary life looks like and what certain activities look like in terms of how they rank their societies. So again, yeah, this is kind of the history. We need to realize that people, if they were living here, in terms of at least we have evidence of 10,000 years ago, so we have at least 5,500 years of no evidence of war, and people probably were not living in sedentary places like these longhouses or whatnot along the coast. They were probably more living more subsistence hunter-gatherer lifestyles. Okay. In terms of European contact, the first contact was 1741 with Russian traders. Well, I got a little typo in there. 1774 is when the Spanish enter the area, and then Lewis and Clark is at 1805. So relatively late contact with the Northwest Coast natives, which actually made for a good area to do some ethnographic data, which Boas does in 1886. So we're still going to see about 140 years of 150 years of contact with traders before Boas and the anthropologists get there. So we're still going to have a hard time with deciding what's what and why people are organized and whether or not contact had an impact on that. But also going back to kind of the war date, the issue is that at 4,500 years ago, we have archaeological evidence, right? This is not that this stories have been passed down and we're just telling stories. We have archaeological evidence of war at 4,500 years ago. So when Boas shows up and the war may be a thing, we now have archaeological evidence to back that up. All right. Chinook Wawa is the language that develops out of this. This is I don't know if you guys have experienced, you may even want to look up on the internet, Pidgin. Pidgin is a combination of kind of Pacific island language with English. So Chinook Wawa would be kind of a blend of native language groups with some of these other Western languages to form a universal language that people could communicate with. So this is in order to trade and kind of set up this economic structure. In 1810, Europeans set up trading posts. Prior to this, the natives kind of controlled and had an advantage because the Europeans, like the Russians and the Spanish, and eventually the British and Americans, would go to the natives to actually do the trading. In 1810, the Europeans set up trading posts, which then transfers the power to the Europeans because now the natives have to go to the Europeans to actually trade their goods. Now remember, the tough part here is that in this process, right, they've now created a structure, at least a more hierarchical division in terms of class system with the trading of fur. So when they get into the fur trade and even the fishing industry later in the 1800s, you're setting up a system where now the natives are dependent on that resource, that money, right? This is the process of creating dependency, at least through kind of westernization and capitalism, is that once you get people hooked on kind of money and or other goods, then they become dependent on that process, which is trading with the Europeans. So this is how the Europeans gain power over them during this kind of time period and in this fashion. Smallpox are obviously going to be introduced, and they wipe out a ton of these people, as well as most of the Americas, minus maybe the Arctic and the subarctic, which is much less than that. Venereal diseases, sexually transmitted diseases, are also introduced to this area with trading. Fishing doesn't become commercial until 1865 when they start to can fish, and then this is going to really kind of completely change the native way of life, which is take what you need, not take more than that. This becomes a profit-driven motive around resources. So this is obviously changing the natives' way of life and kind of their structure of what they believe in. Again, as I mentioned before, it creates a status structure when we get into trading, and the fur trade and the fishing start to create even more status divide in these groups, and it's ultimately ends up even causing changes to their culture because of this monetary kind of increase in wealth, and we start to see more polygyny and changing of marriage laws. So what we get is that more men are now marrying more women, and what I mean is that a man now, if they have enough money, they can afford to have more wives. This might have been more rare before this structure was introduced. Franz Boas comes in 1886, kind of does some anthropology work, becomes very, very fascinating with this group, and then basically is a lifelong learner of these people. A 60-year time period, Boas goes back and forth between the Northwest coast. Takes some time off, doesn't really start to do ethnographic data until kind of the early 1900s, and that's really when he's going to start to meet up and work with George Hunt. George Hunt was a native of this area. This is a picture of George Hunt, and was a native of this area, but was also a trained anthropologist. And this is very, very key in terms of somebody knowing the language, how to kind of navigate, operate. This would be, in my anthropology world, the version of the best, probably the best key informant ever, right? So yeah, I mean, in terms of a key informant, right, you want somebody typically who knows the culture, who knows your language, and who can communicate those things. Again, this would be a trained anthropologist really giving you information. I mean, this, to me, this is almost cheating, but in a good way. Currently in the field, what we call this is native anthropology, or nativist anthropology, and what this moves more towards is that kind of the postmodern change in anthropology has moved towards training people within those groups that you're actually studying to be anthropologists, so that they have a true emic perspective, that true insider perspective, but then they gain the etic outsider kind of anthropological perspective through training. And this is really kind of a big push in the field. So George Hunt would have represented kind of the earliest native anthropologist, right? Where, again, if I wanted to go study Samoan culture, the real information comes not necessarily from me and my research because I have all of my Western bias, but because maybe I train a Samoan to be an anthropologist who then ultimately can shed light on some intricacies that I did not have access to. So yeah, native anthropology is a real big push in the field right now, and it gives us a much more kind of accurate depiction of things. Again, for us who are Americans, a movement in the field is also becoming more so that Americans then are doing anthropological work in America, right? And this is where I'm kind of in the field of anthropology of policy and the impacts and those kinds of things. Currently, again, what I'm looking into right now is the whole gun control versus gun rights kind of debate and policy that comes out of what's happening right now in the country. And this would be a form of native anthropology. Now, the problem is that it's not the romantic, exotic kind of anthropology where you get on a boat and travel around the world and meet some group of people that looks so exotic and lives so exotically that you're just enthralled and come home and write a great book that everybody wants to read. So taking away a little bit of that exotic, but you're definitely giving back in terms of a more accurate depiction of that culture. Okay, so that is native anthropology. Edward Curtis and Frederica de Laguna, also do major work in this area. Edward Curtis is around that time of George Hunt and Franz Boas, so I think he does a lot more of the visual anthropology, and then Frederica is going to be, obviously, look at that, 74 years of studying this area.